Gilded Age is the demographic changes to the United States. And so demographics has to do with the types of people, the groups of people that are living in a country. And so in the mid 19th century, beginning in roughly the 1840s or so, you have the beginnings of very large scale immigration. There's always been immigration to the United States. I mean, the colonists set up colonies. They immigrated from England and other places to set up these colonies. Um, but it's really in the mid 19th century, the 1840s, 1850s, that very, very large numbers, we're talking about millions of people a year, begin arriving um, in the United States to start a new life. The major ports, the major cities they came into are those along the coast. So on the East Coast, you have New York is the biggest one by far, but you also have Boston and Philadelphia receive a lot of new immigrants. And then on the West Coast, the key port is San Francisco. As you might imagine, it's people from Asia largely coming into San Francisco, and the people from Europe largely coming into the East Coast ports. And that's because geographically, Europe is closer to New York, and Asia is closer to San Francisco, right? So that's kind of who's coming where. By large, there's of course all different types of people who end up everywhere, right? Large groups of Irish and Italians do actually end up in San Francisco, but might not necessarily arrive there first. And so this map is kind of a helpful chart to understand um, just how many how many immigrants are coming to this country. So the orange line here is the immigrants as a percentage of the U.S. population. All right, and the blue line is just in total numbers the amount of immigrants who are in the country at any given moment. So if we look back here, about 1850 or so is where the chart starts, and we have about 3 million immigrants, right, which is significant, right? Especially beforehand, there was not that many, and they made up 10% of the country's population, which is substantial. I mean, it's definitely a minority, but it's still substantial. As we get into the 1870s, 80s, 90s, right, we see that number as a percentage goes up. We're now closer to 15% of the population are immigrants. And the absolute number is also rising pretty steadily, right? So in 1850, we have about 3 million. By 1900, we're at 10 million. So more than doubles in 40 years. That continues to happen until 1920. We'll see there's actually a dip there in the 1920s to 1960s. And that's actually because of legislation that's passed to limit the number of immigrants who are allowed to come in. And then in 1965, new laws changed that caused a substantial increase in the number of immigrants, not necessarily the percentage of the population, but a number of immigrants. And so this is just showing us kind of, a huge segment of the population. I mean, 10% is not, it might not seem like a lot, but it's still, 1 in 10 people then in the country are an immigrant. 1 in 10 people were not born in this country, right, at that time period, which is substantial. It's noticeable. Before Ellis Island actually opened, Ellis Island is kind of what we all might associate with immigration in New York. Ellis Island did not open until the 1890s, I believe 1894. And so before then, there was actually very little regulation on immigration. And it was not left up to the federal or national government. It was left up to either local or state governments to try to regulate it. And so there was a place in Lower Manhattan, in Battery Park, it's called Castle Garden. The structure still stands today. It's used kind of where you can go if you want to go buy tickets for the ferry to Ellis Island. You go to Castle Garden. That was the original immigration center of New York City. And so here's an immigrant family arriving in Castle Garden. They were literally just got on a boat in Europe, landed in New York, went in here, and then from there they were processed a little bit and tried to just make themselves a life in the new world. Pretty off hands, right? The government didn't have too much to do, and they were pretty overwhelmed. And so this is 1894 now, and this is so the year that actually the Castle Garden really stops becoming the center of immigration in New York. That's when this photo is taken, and so that building, the circular building, that's what it was. It's still there today. You can go visit Castle Garden if you'd like. You can kind of notice in the background an island with a statue on it. That would be a Statue of Liberty, which was established about a decade or so beforehand. So immigration patterns as of 1900. So the Gilded Age really is from the 1860s, 1870s into about 1900 or so before we get into what we would call the Progressive Era. And so this is kind of what the state of immigration is like in the United States as of 1900, at the turn of the 20th century. So you can see by large, Germans actually make up the largest immigrant group. So even though the Irish are kind of what people think of the most, there's actually more Germans in the country than the Irish. That also has to do with the fact that Ireland is a very small country to begin with, right? And so there was just more German people who were able to immigrate than there would be Irish. But the Irish still make up 16% of the immigrants coming to the United States as of 1900. The rest of them are kind of a smattering of Italians, Russians, other Europeans, very little Chinese, Japanese, or Mexicans. But the immigration type of immigrants in each location varies, right? So in New York, for example, in thousands, so for about 480,000 immigrants in New York State were German, and 425,000 were Irish, right? And the rest kind of are minuscule numbers there. We have Scandinavians, we have some Italians, right? If you go to other places, though, like Wisconsin, the Midwest, which had a much higher concentration of Germans, you can see the percentages there, right? There's 242,000 Germans in Wisconsin, but compared to the next group of people, they outnumber them. Massachusetts, on the other hand, in Boston, right, overwhelmingly they have Irish immigrants. So there's more Irish immigrants in New York City than there are in Boston, but they don't make up as large of a percentage of the population as Boston. But still, at the height in the early 1900s, an estimated 1 in 3 residents of New York City were Irish born, and over 50% were of Irish descent, right? So it's a substantial amount of the population. And Germans are similar, although Germans are kind of spread out throughout the country a little bit more. You can see in California, on the West Coast, it's a little bit different. There's still a majority German and Irish, but you do have these other groups coming in. So there's some Chinese, that's the purplish color there, and the Japanese make up some significant portions of that immigrant population. Texas, the biggest one is Mexicans. So even though Mexicans only make up 1.5% of the total immigrant population, in Texas, they're the majority, right? 72,000 of them. So depending on where you are geographically, you have different types of immigrants living and migrating to those parts of the country. But by and large, the two biggest groups, Germans and Irish, as of 1900, are pretty spread out throughout the whole country. When you go from a country that has relatively little immigration, and the immigration that is coming to the country are from places like England or Scandinavia, and those places shared a lot of common culture and history and religion and practices with the older generations of Americans, the native-born Americans, so to speak. And then also you have large groups of Irish and Germans and Italians, right? Many of whom, the Irish and the Italians are overwhelmingly Catholic. And the Germans, about half the German immigrant population is Catholic, the other half is Protestant. And then in the 1900s and the 1890s, 1900s, you also have immigrants from Russia and Poland. So again, they could be Catholic or Christian, but they could also be, especially Russia, they're Jewish. And so in that 40-year period between the end of the Civil War and the start of the 20th century, you have a pretty dramatic change in what America looks like, particularly in the cities. And this leads to the rise of what we call nativism. And nativism is the belief or the practice, right, that the United States should be protected from these immigrants, and the culture of the American people should be protected, right? And at this time, the culture of the American people was white people who were of Anglo-Saxon descent, which is from England, the British Islands, and they had to be Protestant. So that's the acronym that it was WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That was the dominant culture in American society during this time period, the 1860s, 70s, 80s. And then you have that being upset, or the balance being changed, with the rise of these Catholic immigrants, particularly from Ireland and Germany and then Italy, coming and changing that balance. Not only is the religion changing, but they're also speaking different languages, they have different customs, different values, and just leads to a clash of tensions. So much so that a party known as the Know Nothing Party, it's a political organization, develops to kind of represent these nativist ideas of keeping immigrants out, keeping America Protestant, keeping America white, and that party, the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, comes to define that. And just as a famous political cartoon from the time period, kind of representing these nativist ideas, you can't really make out the writing, but you could see here in the man landing on the boat, from the boat, carrying a sword. He's got a cross on him. He's got a crown. This guy is supposed to represent the Pope, so the Catholic Pope. And then you have some bishops and priests in the boat as well. And they're coming, it looks like they're storming the United States. And you see here on the right-hand side, Uncle Sam kind of sitting there, and there's a small child who, symbolic of the, innocence of children, of the, they're easy to take advantage of, things like that. And so you have this symbol of them coming to kind of take over and brainwash children's minds, and force their new way of belief with the sword, right? Forcing their new system, their new beliefs onto the country. Anti-Catholic sentiment was really large and really prevalent in American society. These Protestants in charge had a huge distrust of Catholics. They believed that they would be more loyal to the Pope and the Church than they would be to the United States. And so anti-Catholicism is one of the key driving factors of this nativist movement. And these Catholic immigrants, these Germans and the Irish that were coming, were seen and viewed in a very negative light by the wealthy white Protestant elite of the country. So much so that they, created cartoons like this to kind of criticize them and judge them, right? And so on the left-hand side, you have the stereotypical Irishman, right, and stereotypical German. The Irish guy is in a barrel of Irish whiskey. The German is in a barrel of German beer. They look violent. They're holding weapons in their hands. And if you notice, they're actually both running away with or carrying the ballot box. And so the biggest fear was that as more of these immigrants arrived, more of them became citizens, more of them had children who became citizens, that they were taking control of the electoral process, right? And the Democratic Party in particular catered to the immigrants at this time. And so they were gaining a lot of political clout, right? And that frightened the Protestant, nativist Americans, because they felt like they were losing control, and they began accusing immigrants of stealing the ballot box, or trying to rig elections, or trying to push through their way of life through elections. And so this is kind of a key cartoon showing and highlighting the bias towards these groups of immigrants. And so during this Gilded Age period and into what we would call the Progressive Era as well, there are laws that are passed that promote this nativist idea, right? Limiting immigration and keeping America American. In 1882, you have racist and nativist laws that lead to Congress to pass something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is the first time in American history, and it was later deemed unconstitutional, that it actually specifically barred any Chinese immigrant from entering the United States. And it was based on the fact that they were Chinese, not because of political affiliation or anything else, but because they were Chinese, they could not come in. And that was in 1882. And for decades, this Chinese Exclusion Act limited severely the amount of Chinese immigrants that could come to the United States. Today, that is no longer in existence, and so there's large numbers of Chinese immigrants today. But this was one step in this process. In 1907, through an informal process known as the Gentleman's Agreement, Japan agreed to limit Japanese immigration to the United States, in particular to California and San Francisco, in exchange for San Francisco getting rid of the laws that segregated against Japanese residents. So for the residents that already lived there, they could then kind of be more fully integrated into society, but they would not allow too many more to actually come to the United States. And this was all kind of motivated and pushed by what we call the Know Nothing Party. That was a political organization that was anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and they were anti-black, right? So really emphasizing that WASP idea, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. All right, and we're actually going to stop there for today, and we'll move into other topics about the Progressive Era and how certain people respond to this, these policies, and some future policies that are put into place that kind of continue this idea of nativism in a future lecture.